Imagine America in 1812. It is a young, boisterous nation, barely a generation removed from its revolutionary birth, teeming with an almost limitless ambition for expansion. To the north lay British North America, the vast, sprawling territory we now know as Canada. To the eyes of politicians in Washington, it looked less like a neighboring country and more like low-hanging fruit, ripe for the plucking. They believed victory was all but assured. Thomas Jefferson himself famously declared that the conquest of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. But history has a way of upending the most certain of predictions. What if I told you that this seemingly inevitable annexation was stopped cold, not just by defensive grit, but by a series of audacious, high-stakes counterattacks that completely flipped the script on the invaders? Prepare to step back into a forgotten theatre of war, where a grossly outnumbered collection of professional soldiers, local militia, and indigenous warriors pulled off one of the most stunning reversals in military history, securing the future of a nation that was never supposed to exist. To understand how close Canada came to being extinguished, we must first grasp the sheer scale of the disparity between the belligerents. In 1812, the United States boasted a population of roughly 7.5 million people. British North America, split between Upper and Lower Canada, held perhaps 500,000 souls. The arithmetic of war was brutally simple. The Americans had the manpower, the resources, and the initiative. The timing seemed perfect for the Americans. Great Britain was locked in a titanic, existential death struggle against Napoleon Bonaparte across the Atlantic. The British Army was stretched to its breaking point, fighting on the Iberian Peninsula, and the Royal Navy was fully committed to blockading Europe. The last thing London wanted, or could afford, was another war on a distant frontier. The defence of Canada was, by necessity, an afterthought, driven by a complex mix of grievances, including British maritime restrictions that choked American trade, the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, and a fervent belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the entire continent was destined to be American territory. President James Madison signed the declaration of war in June 1812. The American grand strategy was fundamentally sound on paper. They planned a three-pronged invasion designed to slice through the lengthy, undefended border. One army would strike in the west from Detroit, another would cross the Niagara River in the center, and a third would push up the Lake Champlain corridor toward Montreal in the east, aiming to sever the crucial St. Lawrence River lifeline that connected the interior to the Atlantic. The prevailing assumption in Washington was that the diverse population of Canada would welcome the American army with open arms. They believed the French Canadians in Lower Canada, conquered by Britain only 50 years prior, chafed under British rule. They also assumed the many recent American immigrants who had settled in Upper Canada for cheap land would instinctively side with their former countrymen. The invasion was billed not as a conquest, but as a liberation. This supreme overconfidence manifested immediately. In July 1812, American Brigadier General William Hull led his army across the Detroit River into Canadian territory, marking the first major act of the war. Hull, an aging veteran of the Revolution, immediately issued a pompous proclamation to the inhabitants of Canada. He promised them peace, liberty, and security if they remained neutral, but threatened a war of extermination should they dare to fight alongside the British savages, referring to the indigenous peoples. It was a moment of supreme hubris. The American Colossus had stepped over the line, expecting immediate capitulation. Instead, they found a very different reality waiting in the woods and along the waterways of the northern frontier. The mere matter of marching was about to become a desperate fight for survival. To understand why the American invasion stalled so spectacularly, we have to look closely at who was actually standing in their way. The defense of this massive border fell primarily to a terrifyingly small number of men. In all of Upper and Lower Canada, there were fewer than 6,000 British regulars. These were the men of the 41st and 49th Regiments of Foot, Career soldiers who wore the king's red coat not as a costume, but as a statement of professional intent. While the American forces were often composed of hastily raised militia, farmers and shopkeepers with little training and often even less discipline, the British regulars were a different breed entirely. Hardened by drill and discipline, they were the steel spine of the defence. They operated with a mechanical precision that unnerved their opponents. But 6,000 men scattered across 1,000 miles of wilderness is a pitifully thin line. They could not be everywhere at once. They needed to move, and they needed to move fast. This is where the geography of the war becomes a character in its own right. Before the era of railroads or reliable highways, the only way to move armies and heavy cannons through the dense Canadian forests was by water. Control of the Great Lakes was not just an advantage, it was a necessity. In 1812, the British Provincial Marine, a small, cobbled-together naval force, held a tenuous mastery over these waters. This allowed the British to shift their meagre forces rapidly from one crisis point to another, often arriving days or weeks before the Americans expected them. But resources and geography mean nothing without leadership. And here, the British possessed a weapon the Americans had severely underestimated: Major General Isaac Brock. Brock was a man of immense energy and charisma, a career officer who found himself in command of Upper Canada just as the storm broke. His superior, the Governor-General George Prevost, was a cautious administrator who ordered a strictly defensive strategy. He wanted to preserve troops and avoid provoking the Americans further. Brock, however, understood something crucial about the psychology of this war. He knew that a passive defense would look like weakness to the wavering Canadian population and, more importantly, to the indigenous nations whose support was vital. Brock decided to ignore his orders. He chose to attack. His first move was to secure an alliance that would terrify the American command. He met with Tecumseh, the visionary Shawnee leader, who was attempting to unite the indigenous tribes into a great confederacy to stop American expansion. The two men, coming from vastly different worlds, recognized in each other a kindred warrior spirit. Tecumseh reportedly said of Brock, "This is a man." Together, they hatched a daring plan to strike at General Hull's army at Detroit. The campaign for Detroit in August 1812 is a masterclass in psychological warfare. Brock arrived with a small force of regulars and militia, vastly outnumbered by Hull's entrenched army inside the fort. But Brock and Tecumseh knew their enemy. They knew General Hull was terrified of indigenous warfare and prone to panic. Brock orchestrated a theatre of deception. He instructed his local militia to don the cast-off uniforms of British regulars, making his force of professional soldiers appear twice as large as it actually was. He had his troops march in continuous loops through a clearing visible from the American fort, the same men appearing again and again, creating the illusion of a ceaseless column of thousands arriving for the siege. Then came the psychological blow. Tecumseh's warriors flitted through the woods, their war cries piercing the air, while Brock sent a letter to Hull demanding surrender. In it, he wrote with chilling calculation that while he could control his British troops, he could not be responsible for the actions of his indigenous allies once the battle began. The bluff worked perfectly. Terrified by the prospect of a massacre and convinced he was facing an overwhelming force, General Hull completely collapsed. On August 16, 1812, without a single shot being fired in defense, Hull surrendered the fort, his entire army of 2,500 men, and the Michigan Territory to Isaac Brock. It was an electrifying victory. In one stroke, the British had secured their western flank, captured invaluable supplies, and shattered the myth of American invincibility. The shockwave of Detroit rippled across the continent. It galvanized the Canadian militia, who realized the Americans could be beaten. It solidified the indigenous alliance, bringing thousands of warriors to the British cause. And it proved that the defense of Canada would be aggressive, unpredictable, and surprisingly lethal. But the war was far from over, and tragedy was waiting just around the corner. The euphoria of Detroit was short-lived. The American juggernaut, though bruised, was already regrouping for a second, more determined strike. This time, the hammer would fall on the Niagara frontier, the narrow strip of land separating New York State from Upper Canada. Here, the Niagara River churns violently between the two nations, a natural barrier that was about to become a graveyard. In October 1812, barely 2 months after the miracle at Detroit, the Americans launched their center prong. Under the cover of darkness, an invasion force began rowing across the turbulent river toward the village of Queenston. Their objective was to seize the high ground, the heights, which commanded the entire region. If Queenston Heights fell, the British defensive line along the Niagara would crumble. General Brock was at Fort George, miles away, when the sound of distant cannon fire woke him. True to his nature, he didn't wait for his main army to assemble. He leapt onto his horse and galloped furiously toward the sound of the guns, his personal aide-de-camp racing to keep up. When Brock arrived at Queenston, he found a chaotic scene. The Americans had found a hidden fisherman's path up the steep cliffs and had already captured the Redan Battery, a crucial artillery position high on the slope. Brock knew that if the Americans were allowed to fortify that position, the battle was lost. In the heat of the moment, the impulsive brilliance that had won Detroit ultimately doomed him. He rallied the nearby troops, mostly men of the 49th Regiment and local militia, and led a direct frontal charge up the steep, muddy slope to retake the gun. It was a gallant, desperate act. As he waved his men forward, sword in hand, an American marksman stepped out from the brush and fired. The bullet struck Brock in the chest. The savior of Upper Canada died almost instantly. For a moment, it seemed the defense of Canada had died with him. The British attack faltered and they fell back. The Americans held the heights. They had the numbers, the position, and the momentum. But the Battle of Queenston Heights was not decided by a general's charge. It was decided by the very people the Americans had dismissed. While the British regulars regrouped, a terrifying sound began to echo through the autumn woods, the war cries of the Grand River warriors. A force of Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee fighters, led by Chiefs John Norton and John Brant, began a masterful skirmish action against the American flanks. Outnumbered and outgunned, these indigenous warriors used the terrain to perfection, pinning down the massive American force with constant harassing fire. They bought critical hours for British reinforcements to arrive. General Roger Sheaffe, Brock's second-in-command, a man far more cautious and methodical than his predecessor, marched his troops on a long flank march to gain the heights from the rear. When the final attack came, it was a coordinated hammer blow. British bayonets swept in from one side, militia from the other, and the indigenous warriors closed the trap. The American invaders, trapped against the precipice of the Niagara Gorge, with the roaring river hundreds of feet below, panicked. Some threw themselves over the cliffs to their deaths, rather than face the scalping knife they so feared. Over 900 Americans surrendered. The invasion had been crushed, but the cost was astronomical. The British had lost their most charismatic leader. The victory at Queenston Heights proved that the regulars, militia, and indigenous allies could fight as a cohesive unit, but it also signaled a darker turn in the war. The initial chivalry was fading. The conflict was becoming a grinding, bloody stalemate, where no quarter would be asked and none given. As 1813 dawned, the Americans, stung by repeated humiliations, began to learn from their mistakes. They realized that to take Canada, they didn't just need to march, they needed to bleed. And the bloodiest days were yet to come. By late 1813, the American strategy shifted its focus to the jugular. They realized that pecking away at the edges in Detroit or Niagara was futile if the head remained intact. The head was Montreal. If the Americans could capture Montreal, they would choke off the St. Lawrence River, severing the supply lines between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes. The entire British defense in the interior, starved of ammunition and reinforcements, would wither and die. To deliver this death blow, the United States assembled its largest invasion force yet. A massive pincer movement was devised. One army would sweep down the St. Lawrence, while another, consisting of over 4,000 men under General Wade Hampton, would march north from Lake Champlain. The American command was banking on a crucial socio-political assumption. They believed that the French Canadians, the habitants, who lived in Lower Canada, modern-day Quebec, had no loyalty to the British crown. Why would they fight for a Protestant king who had conquered their ancestors only 50 years prior? The Americans expected them to stand aside, or better yet, join the revolution. They were about to be proven wrong, not by British redcoats, but by a man named Charles de Salaberry and his voltigeurs. De Salaberry was a French-Canadian aristocrat who had served in the British Army across the globe. He returned home to raise a unit of light infantry, the Canadian voltigeurs, composed entirely of French-Canadian volunteers. These were men who knew the forests, knew the rivers, and were fighting not just for a king across the ocean, but for their own distinct culture, their Catholic faith, and their land, all of which they feared would be swallowed by the Protestant, English-speaking American Republic. In October 1813, General Hampton's massive American army crossed the border, moving sluggishly through the dense woods along the Chateauguay River. Blocking their path was de Salaberry, with a motley force of roughly 1,600 men, mostly voltigeurs, fencibles, and indigenous warriors. They were outnumbered nearly 3-1. De Salaberry knew he couldn't win a stand-up fight in an open field. So he turned the landscape into a weapon. He chose a choke point where the river curved, creating a narrow corridor through the forest. There, his men constructed an abattis, a terrifying tangle of felled trees with sharpened branches pointing toward the enemy, effectively creating a wooden wall across the road. When the Americans attacked on October 26th, the forest exploded. The voltigeurs, hidden behind the abattis and scattered in the woods, poured accurate, withering fire into the American columns. The Americans, confused by the dense terrain and the smoke, couldn't see their enemy. They could only hear the screams of their wounded. Then de Salaberry played his masterstroke. He had stationed buglers in different locations deep in the woods, far behind his front line. At his signal, they all began to blow the advance call simultaneously. The piercing notes echoed off the trees from all directions, creating an auditory hallucination. To the terrified American troops, it sounded as if thousands of British reinforcements were swarming out of the wilderness to surround them. Panic set in. General Hampton, convinced he was facing a massive army rather than a small band of militia, ordered a full retreat. The Phantom Army had won. The Battle of Chateauguay was a stunning victory that didn't just save Montreal, it shattered the American assumption that Canada was a house divided. The French Canadians had stepped onto the stage of history, proving that the defense of the North was a truly national effort. But while the land was being held by ruse and resilience, the war was taking a terrifying turn on the water, where there were no trees to hide behind. To understand the precarious survival of Canada, you have to look away from the battlefields and toward the vast inland seas of the Great Lakes. In the early 19th century, there were no roads capable of sustaining an army. The dense wilderness was an impassable barrier for heavy cannon and supply wagons. The only true highways were the water. Whoever controlled Lake Erie and Lake Ontario controlled the war. If the British lost the lakes, their armies in the west would starve, and their indigenous alliances would crumble. What followed was one of the most frantic and surreal arms races in history. In remote backwaters like Kingston and Sackett's Harbour, shipwrights waged a war of sawdust and iron. Both sides worked through the brutal Canadian winters, frantically chopping down green timber to build massive warships. It was a contest of speed. Whichever side could launch a bigger ship with more guns first would dominate the season. For the first year of the war, the British Provincial Marine held the edge. But the Americans, with their superior industrial base, began to catch up. In September 1813, the crisis reached a breaking point on Lake Erie. The American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry constructed a fleet seemingly out of thin air and challenged the British squadron. The resulting Battle of Lake Erie was a catastrophe for the British. In a brutal, close-range pounding match, the entire British squadron was captured. Perry famously reported, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The consequences were immediate and devastating. With the lake lost, the British supply line to the west was severed. The army defending Detroit was forced to retreat, abandoning the territory Isaac Brock had won a year earlier. This retreat led directly to the tragedy of the Battle of the Thames, where the British army was run down and defeated. In the chaos, the great Tecumseh, the architect of the Indigenous Confederacy, was killed. His dream of a united indigenous state died with him, and the western flank of the British defence collapsed completely. However, the war was not lost, because the heart still beat. While disaster unfolded in the west, the British maintained a white-knuckled grip on Lake Ontario and, crucially, the St. Lawrence River. This was the carotid artery of the empire. Through this river, a steady stream of supplies, gunpowder, and, eventually, reinforcements from Britain continued to flow. The naval war on Lake Ontario became a bizarre dance of giants. The opposing commanders, Sir James Yeo and Isaac Chauncey, engaged in a cautious game of cat and mouse, building larger and larger ships, some eventually rivaling Nelson's HMS Victory in size, yet rarely engaging in decisive combat. They both knew that to lose their fleet was to lose the war instantly. By refusing to lose, the Royal Navy kept the lifeline open, and as 1814 arrived, that lifeline would bring a new and terrifying variable into the equation. Napoleon was defeated in Europe. The British Empire could finally turn its full, undivided attention to the annoying little war in North America. The veterans were coming. By the summer of 1814, the geopolitical landscape had shifted tectonically. Napoleon Bonaparte had abdicated and was exiled to Elba. The Great War in Europe was over. This meant that thousands of battle-hardened British regulars, men who had spent years fighting the finest armies in the world under the Duke of Wellington, were suddenly available for service in North America. They boarded ships bound for Quebec, bringing with them a cold professionalism and a desire to finish this colonial distraction. However, the Americans were not waiting to be crushed. They had spent the winter drilling and training. Under the command of capable leaders like Winfield Scott and Jacob Brown, the American army on the Niagara frontier was no longer a ragtag mob of militia. They were disciplined, uniformed, and eager to prove they could stand toe-to-toe with the British Empire. In July 1814, the Americans launched their final, desperate gamble to conquer Upper Canada. They crossed the Niagara River yet again, capturing Fort Erie and moving north. But this time, they didn't face panicked defenders. They ran headlong into a British force that was digging in for a fight. The collision happened on July 25, 1814, at a place called Lundy's Lane. It sits on a rise of land just a mile from the thundering cataract of Niagara Falls. What followed was not just a battle, it was a horror story. The fighting began in the late afternoon, under a sweltering sun. The British held the high ground, centered around a cemetery where their artillery batteries poured fire down on the advancing Americans. But instead of breaking, the Americans advanced. For the first time in the war, American regulars maneuvered with the precision of Europeans. They charged the British guns, capturing the Hilltop Battery in a shocking display of grit. As the sun set, the battlefield plunged into darkness, but the killing didn't stop. Lundy's Lane became a soldier's battle, a confused, chaotic brawl fought at point-blank range in the pitch black. The only illumination came from the muzzle flashes of muskets and the explosion of artillery shells. The noise was apocalyptic. The roar of musketry was constant, but underneath it all was the ceaseless, low-frequency rumble of Niagara Falls, vibrating through the ground and the bodies of the men. Smoke hung heavy in the humid air, choking the combatants until they could barely breathe. Confusion reigned supreme. In the darkness, units became intermingled. British officers accidentally shouted orders to American troops. American platoons stumbled into lines of British bayonets. It was a slaughterhouse. Men fired at shapes in the gloom, often killing their own comrades. The British counterattacked again and again to retake their guns, clashing bayonet against bayonet over the graves of the cemetery. The fighting continued until midnight, an almost unheard-of duration for the era. By the time the firing died down, both armies were exhausted, dehydrated, and shattered. The casualties were horrific. Over nearly 900 men on each side were killed, wounded, or missing. Tactically, the battle was a confused stalemate. The Americans withdrew from the hill, leaving the British in possession of the field, simply because they had no water and no ammunition left. But strategically, Lundy's Lane was the turning point. The American army had been bled white. They had thrown their best punch with their best troops, and the British line had bent, but it had not broken. Broken and demoralized, the American invasion force retreated back to the stone walls of Fort Erie. They would never threaten the interior of Canada again. The dream of a quick conquest had ended in a cemetery in the dark. The invasion was effectively over. But the war had one final, brutal lesson to teach. A lesson about the futility of vengeance and the resilience of a people pushed to the brink. Following the carnage at Lundy's Lane, the battered American army withdrew into the strong defences of Fort Erie. The British, sensing blood, followed them and laid siege. What ensued was a wet, miserable, and ultimately futile struggle in the mud. For weeks, the two sides pounded each other with artillery. The British attempted a disastrous night assault that ended in a massive accidental explosion, killing hundreds of attackers in seconds. It was the final, gory spasm of the Niagara Campaign. By November 1814, with winter closing in, the Americans realized the futility of their position. They had no hope of advancing further into Canada. In a final act of defiance, they blew up Fort Erie, destroyed the fortifications, and crossed the river back to American soil. The last American boot had left Canadian ground. The invasion was officially defeated. But while the guns fell silent on the northern frontier, the war had mutated into something else entirely. The British, now fully unleashed from the Napoleonic Wars, were no longer just defending, they were punishing. In August 1814, a British expeditionary force burned the White House and the Capitol in Washington, D.C., a direct retaliation for the American burning of the Parliament buildings in York, modern-day Toronto, earlier in the war. The message was clear. The young republic was vulnerable, and the cost of their aggression was coming home. Yet, despite these dramatic raids, the war had reached a stalemate. The British public, exhausted by decades of war with France, had no appetite for a prolonged conquest of America. The American economy was in ruins due to the British naval blockade. Both sides wanted out. On Christmas Eve, 1814, in the neutral city of Ghent, Belgium, British and American diplomats signed a peace treaty. The terms were remarkably simple. Status quo ante bellum, the state of things as they were before the war. On paper, it looked as if the war had been a complete waste of time. No borders changed, not a single inch of land was exchanged. The maritime rights and impressment issues that supposedly started the war were barely mentioned, as they were no longer relevant with Napoleon defeated. But there was one group for whom the war was not a draw. It was a catastrophic defeat. Throughout the conflict, the British had promised their indigenous allies, the Shawnee, the Mohawk, the Odawa, and many others, that they would not sign a peace treaty without securing an independent indigenous buffer state in the Northwest Territory. This state was meant to be a permanent barrier against American expansion, a homeland where the First Nations could live sovereign and free. It was the dream Tecumseh had died for. During the negotiations at Ghent, the British diplomats initially held firm to this demand. But the Americans were immovable. They refused to cede sovereign territory. Weary of war and unwilling to derail the peace process, the British ultimately capitulated. They abandoned the demand. When the treaty was signed, the indigenous nations were left out in the cold. The British, their fathers and allies, had effectively washed their hands of the Northwest. Without British military support, the tribes could not hold back the tide of American settlers. The border became a hard line, cutting through traditional indigenous territories. The alliance that had saved Canada in its darkest hour was dissolved with a stroke of a pen in a European palace. For the Americans, the war became a second war of independence, celebrated for victories like the Battle of New Orleans, fought tragically after the peace treaty was signed. For the British, it was a forgotten skirmish, a footnote to the Napoleonic saga. But for the people of British North America, the war was everything. They had faced a colossus and survived. They had seen their farms burned and their friends killed, but they had not been conquered. As the smoke cleared, the residents of Upper and Lower Canada looked at each other and realized something profound. They were not Americans. They were not just displaced Britons. They were something else. Something new was beginning to take shape in the northern snows. A national identity forged in the fire of defence. In the years that followed the War of 1812, a comfortable myth began to take root in the Canadian consciousness. It was a story told around hearths and in schoolrooms, a narrative that would define the nascent nation for a century. It was called the militia myth. The story went that the invasion was repelled not by the professional soldiers of the British Empire, but by the pluck and determination of the common Canadian farmer, the citizen soldier who grabbed his musket from above the mantle to defend his home against the foreign aggressor. While romantic, this was only half the truth. As we have seen, without the steely discipline of the British regulars and the terrifying effectiveness of the indigenous warriors, the militia would have been swept aside in weeks. But myths serve a purpose. This story gave the scattered, disparate colonies of British North America a unifying legend. It told them that they were tough, that they were loyal, and most importantly, that they were distinct from their noisy Republican neighbours to the south. The war cemented the existence of Canada. Before 1812, it was entirely possible, perhaps even probable, that the colonies would have eventually drifted into the American orbit through simple economic and cultural gravity. The invasion changed that trajectory forever. It drew a line in the sand, or rather, a line through the Great Lakes and the 49th parallel that became indelible. The violence of the war forced the inhabitants to choose a side, and in choosing to fight, they chose to be Canadian. This unity was not just between the colonies, but within them. The war saw English-speaking loyalists fighting alongside French-speaking voltigeurs. At the Battle of Châteauguay, French Canadians proved definitively that they were not merely conquered subjects of the British Crown, but active defenders of their own land. It was the first time that the two solitudes of Canada, English and French, bled together for a common cause. It was an imperfect union, fraught with future tensions, but it was a start. The tragedy, of course, lies in those who were written out of the story. For decades, the crucial contributions of Tecumseh and the indigenous nations were marginalized, treated as a colorful footnote rather than the strategic keystone they were. It is only now, centuries later, that we are fully reckoning with the debt Canada owes to the First Nations, a debt paid in blood and betrayal. Today, the border between Canada and the United States is the longest undefended border in the world. It is a testament to 2 centuries of peace and friendship. But if you walk the quiet fields of Queenston Heights, or stand on the banks of the Châteauguay River, or look out over the misty waters of Lundy's Lane, you can still feel the echoes of that desperate struggle. You can imagine the redcoats standing shoulder to shoulder in the gloom. You can hear the war cries in the woods and the roar of the cannons shaking the earth. You can see the shadow of Isaac Brock charging up the hill, and Tecumseh vanishing into the trees. The Americans came to conquer a colony. Instead, they inadvertently forged a nation. The mere matter of marching turned out to be the crucible in which the soul of Canada was cast. And that, perhaps, is the greatest irony of the War of 1812. By trying to erase the border, the United States ensured that it would last forever. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten battles that saved Canada, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. What do you think was the most pivotal moment of the war? Was it Brock's bluff at Detroit, or the stand at Lundy's Lane? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to join us for more expeditions into military history, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching.